Welcome back, fellow scholars. Let's get right into it, shall we? In this explainer, we're going to rigorously apply our 11-step global Madhyamaka diagnostic framework to Chapter 5 of Nāgārjuna's text. Now, you're already familiar with the intense logical teardowns from our previous sessions on causality and perception. But today, we are placing the very fabric of our physical reality under the ultimate philosophical microscope.
So, just briefly mapping out our journey today, we're going to cover Chapter 5's irreducible elements, the triad of characterization, deconstruction via the tetralemma, the union of two truths, entering the middle way, and finally, primordial equality in action. All right, Part 1, Chapter 5, Irreducible Elements. We are really targeting the absolute foundation of reality here. We're moving way past macro-level constructs to strip the universe down to its barest conceptual studs. And to do this right, we have to keep our mental models strictly at that microscopic foundation. We are absolutely not talking about macro objects here. We aren't comparing these elements to, say, the wood that composes a table. No, we are dissecting the invisible fundamental building blocks of reality. Think along the lines of subatomic particles or invisible atoms. The foundational elements like earth, water, fire, wind, space, and their inherent characteristics like solidity, heat, or mobility.
Let's move on to Part 2, the triad of characterization. You know, whenever the human mind tries to comprehend any action or state, it just naturally chops it up into little pieces. Applying our standard diagnostic, we're going to start with the first 3 deconstructive steps of our 11-step process. First, we identify the cognitive triad. Next, we test it against 4 logical extremes. And finally, we witness the necessary conclusion of emptiness.
What's truly fascinating about this cognitive reflex is how our dualistic mind automatically slices the baseline of reality into a very specific triad. Just to even speak of a fundamental particle, your brain instantly generates 3 distinct spheres: the defining characteristic, the action of characterizing, and the characterized element itself. It happens in a flash. It's a completely inescapable cognitive habit.
Which brings us to Part 3, deconstruction via the tetralemma.
Now that we've identified the target, we have to subject this triad to the ultimate stress test for human cognition. This is really where Nāgārjuna just seals off every single logical exit. By taking the tetralemma, we demonstrate that the irreducible elements and their characteristics absolutely cannot be different, identical, both, or neither. Why? Because every single one of those 4 extreme positions leads directly to contradiction and absurdity. I mean, think about it. If the element and its characteristic were perfectly identical, the distinction completely collapses. There'd be absolutely nothing left to define. But on the flip side, if they were inherently different, they'd be completely isolated in their own separate little bubbles, totally unable to interact. And trying to combine them as both or wave them away as neither just stacks logical errors on top of each other. It doesn't work. So, the crucial takeaway here, step 3, is that because the tetralemma systematically destroys all 4 logical extremes, these subatomic elements and their characteristics are totally ungraspable. They are completely empty of inherent existence. They lack any fixed, standalone, independent essence. They are never absolute, period. Okay, Part 4, the union of two truths. Now, from this profound realization of emptiness, we pivot to reconstituting conventional reality. It's important to remember we haven't deleted the universe. We've just cured our delusion of its absolute solidity. This brings us right into steps 4 through 6 of our diagnostic framework, where we look at how phenomena actually function without an absolute essence. Because that's the big question, right? How does a world made of empty elements actually operate? The answer is dependent co-origination. Because these basic components are empty of absolute reality, they are completely inseparable and interdependent. They lean against each other perfectly. They exist purely as cognitive software, as mere names and conventional tools, imputed by the mind. Just like the concept of a parent simply cannot exist without a child, a defining characteristic cannot exist without an element to define. They co-emerge and co-evolve simultaneously. And this is just brilliant because it illustrates that the conventional truth of their functioning perfectly supports the ultimate truth of their emptiness, and vice versa, the union of the two truths. It's precisely because these elements are empty of some frozen inherent existence that they actually have the breathing room to interact, shift, and define each other in this boundless, centerless fractal loop. So for step 6, we conclude that because they are dependently arisen and empty, these invisible components of reality are functionally present. They have real causal impact, yet they are completely ungraspable at their core. It's a lot like an echo in a canyon. If you shout into a massive canyon, the sound wave functionally exists, right? It can echo back and startle a bird. But if you try to reach out and grab the solid absolute core of that echo, your hand just closes on empty air. They are there, yet not there.
That leads us nicely into part 5, entering the middle way. Now, we have to be incredibly careful here to prevent our minds from turning this beautiful concept of emptiness into a new dogmatic religion. We cannot just trade an iron chain of inherent existence for a golden chain of emptiness. So step 7 demands we apply the generalized tetralemma to affirm that these elements are completely free from any categorical label for whatever this happens to be. They are not this, they are not non-this, not both, and not neither. We are abandoning the conceptual grid entirely. Which brings us to step 9, the middle way itself. This perfectly neutralizes the two great sicknesses of philosophy by neither accepting nor rejecting the three spheres in absolute terms. Think of the middle way like riding a bicycle. If you lean too far into eternalism or naive realism, grasping at solid elements, you crash. If you lean too far the other way into nihilism or solipsism, believing nothing exists and ignoring causality, you also crash. We have to dynamically pedal right in that space between the extremes. And finally, part 6, primordial equality in action. Because at the end of the day, philosophy is really only as good as its application. This brings us to the final psychological shift, the ultimate practical question for us as scholars returning to the conventional world. When we step away from the texts, how do we actually navigate traffic, hold conversations, and engage with the material world if everything is just an echo? Step 10 gives us the answer. We use them conventionally, but never in absolute terms. We utilize these elemental models as functional tools. It's about acting without acting, engaging passionately with reality without being crushed by the weight of absolute extremes. It's like building a heavy wooden raft to cross a raging river. You absolutely use the raft to survive the crossing, but once you reach the other shore, you don't pick it up and carry it on your back forever. You drop it. You drop the concepts. And then, step 11. We finally rest in the strictly non-dual realization. Not many, not one, not both, not neither. We recognize that the perceiver and these fundamental subatomic particles share the exact same luminous, empty, interdependent nature. They are primordially equal. And because you realize you are just an overlapping, permeable node in this vast cycle, boundless compassion arises completely spontaneously. Logically, you see that to harm another is quite literally to inject poison into your own interconnected environment. So, as you step back into your day, I want to leave you with a final, provocative challenge to test the true empty nature of your own perception. Watch the machinery of your mind today. In the exact fraction of a microsecond before you impute the next categorical label onto the rushing river of reality, what actually exists in that silent, unlabeled gap? Keep exploring that space, and I'll see you in the next explainer.